Beienburg is Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute, and he's joining us now. Matt, I'm glad you're on the show, and it's interesting to talk about education transparency. Now, I teased this earlier in the program. I think as we look back on the last 2 years of the pandemic, nearly exactly to the day, 2 years, and all the things that have changed along the way parents view their kids' education, I think, has been dramatically transformed because they've seen firsthand, in many cases, what's happening in their school systems because they've been exposed to it via Zoom and remote learning, which I get. We don't think that kids are receiving the same quality education that they would normally get in the classroom as they did over remote learning. However, for the first time, perhaps in generations, parents have actually gotten a glimpse inside of their kids' classroom and learned firsthand some of the indoctrination that's taken place there.
That's right, and thanks for having me on. I think you nailed it, right on the head. What we're seeing is during COVID, parents for the first time, as you said, in a generation, really got to see what's happening, with Zoom classes and actually getting to see what's going on in their kids' classroom. And shockingly, they weren't a fan of a lot of the real politically infused indoctrination type of content that was being pushed in a lot of these classrooms. So parents saw, things like the New York Times 1619 Project being used in classrooms, teaching kids that, America is founded, fundamentally on racism and slavery, and parents starting to ask questions about this. And now we're seeing this massive movement as parents are saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with this idea of education being a black box, except for these rare glimpses that we got through Zoom. We want to be able to be engaged in what our kids are learning. We want to know what kids are learning when we're making an enrollment decision about our students. And so we're now seeing this massive movement toward transparency in education. And that's an area that we've been working on here at Goldwater, many of our partner groups, and now seeing across the nation. Over 20 states have put out legislation to help empower parents and give them a window and a glimpse into K-12.
All right, so let's talk before we talk more about parents getting involved for the first time, and really parents should be involved. It shouldn't have taken a pandemic for them to learn firsthand what's happening in classrooms. How prevalent is this problem? How widespread has the curriculum, as abuse of the curriculum begun by teachers and school systems around the country?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's very widespread. We see this in places, even in subjects you would think would be immune from this. The Seattle Public Schools had proposed an ethnic studies mathematics framework where they were saying, how can we change mathematics from individualistic to collectivist thinking? That kind of thing. 1619 Project has now been used in all 50 states. We're seeing teachers themselves write and say, we need to have politics in the classroom, explicitly calling for infusing essentially all grade levels, all subjects with politics, or what they, in many cases, sort of brand as something like anti-racism, even when those materials are something like Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, which teaches kids explicitly to discriminate against others based upon their skin color. So it's something that we're seeing across the board, not just contained to a few areas or a few subjects.
And is this isolated to any part of the country as opposed to another? Is it more geographically prevalent? Is it based on perhaps the politics of a state itself? You mentioned some 20-odd states that have enacted legislation, but I would be willing to bet that those 20-some-odd states are controlled by Republican legislatures or Republican governor.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we see in a lot of the traditionally blue areas, the more explicit kind of going all in, adopting formally things like the 1619 Project. But even in red states and more right-leaning or conservative states, what we're seeing is this content gets adopted, if not necessarily formally at the school district level. The principals, the teachers, the curriculum coaches at these schools are still pulling resources from the teachers' unions. They're still pulling BLM type of content that they take that's coming from these kind of activist organizations and inserting that into the schools. And so this isn't something that's constrained just to California or New York. We're seeing this happening around the country, even in states that typically, this is not something that reflects the priorities of those states and of the parents there, and yet we're seeing this happen. And so that's where these 20 states that have introduced legislation are saying, you know what, we're going to start putting that power back in the hands of parents, so that regardless of whether or not the district is trying to push this stuff in secret, because that's again what we're seeing a lot of the times, where it's just them saying, oh, it's not part of our officially adopted curriculum, don't worry about it. But yes, we're having our teachers, pull information from the internet and assign it to the kids, even if it's completely age inappropriate or politically activists and all that sort of content.
Well, and it's unfortunate too, because many teachers just have poor judgment when it comes to these kind of lesson plans. And I say that because I do believe that Black history has been dramatically underrepresented in our school system and in our curriculum. And I think there's probably room across the board for an improved lesson plan that is more inclusive about all Americans and all history and all world history for that matter. But when teachers become activists and get involved, you see the idiocracy of what happened this week in San Antonio. We're talking with Matt Beienburg, Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute. I don't know if I'm sure you did. I mean, this is your job. This popped up on my feed this week. Children in an elementary school segregated by the color of their hair as part of a lesson plan on racism by the teacher. I mean, that's just, I can understand to a certain degree the point the teacher's trying to, but that's a bad way to go about teaching that lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen everything from these affinity groups where kids get, segregated essentially by race in many of these cases. We see privilege bingo, privilege walks, essentially shaming kids to feel bad about their race. There are groups that you kind of mentioned this in terms of actually providing good content. There's an organization, 1776 Unites. It's a group of predominantly Black scholars. They've put together free lesson plans that actually do advance and focus in on the contributions and experiences of African Americans throughout American history without sort of throwing in with the far left that says, we're going to twist history. We're going to tell the true history of the country. We're not going to varnish it or gloss over things, but we're going to tell this in a way that's honest. So there are groups out there that I think are doing exactly what you've called for. And that's where right now parents have such an inability to know, well, is the school down the street using something like the 1776 Unites curriculum, or are they using 1619? And that's where these parents right now who have tried to get answers, we've seen this in states, if they go and ask, you'd think, well, just ask the teacher or ask the principal. We've seen all these instances of parents even testifying now in state legislatures saying, I tried to do exactly that, and I was told I had to submit a formal public records request just to be able to see the content. The district's charging them hundreds or thousands of dollars just to get basic answers. So this academic or curriculum transparency legislation that we're helping to support and that now is moving across the country essentially says, you know what, let's make sure we're in the 21st century. There's no reason that our public schools can't post online a listing of the materials that are actually being used so that parents can know and they can engage with their students. They can make informed enrollment decisions. So this legislation is moving across the country. There's a bill even in Ohio right now. Arizona just passed its state senate a version of this yesterday. So seeing sweeping momentum across the country in this area now.
Well, and when parents have gone to stand up, and I admit in many cases, parents have not done this the right way. Parents have been abusive in school board settings. I get that. I'm not saying that every parent has conducted themselves appropriately in voicing their concerns, but they have the right to voice concerns. And when they have, the Department of Justice has come back and labeled many parents as domestic terrorists.
That's right. And I think there is a disdain that we're seeing from a lot of politicians and activists that essentially say, parents should be butting out of this process instead of being engaged partners in this. And so I think the disrespect that we've seen toward parents and obviously a lot of frustration bubbling up amongst parents about school closures, about curriculum content. And I think something like this transparency legislation, should be something that everybody can agree with, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. And yet we're seeing teachers' unions and now the media jump in against this. And again, trying to essentially say, just leave it to the so-called experts and professionals, and you shouldn't be involved in asking questions or even wanting to know what your kids are teaching. The ACLU literally came out on social media a few weeks ago and said these curriculum transparency measures that states are pushing are just a thinly veiled attempt to chill teachers from talking about race and gender with students, which begs that question of, if you're really concerned that parents might know what materials you're using to teach their kids around things like race or gender, if you're not comfortable with the parents even knowing that, that's very much a red flag that there's a concern here.
All right. So is there an organized effort behind this? Are there left-wing liberal groups that are funding the teachers' unions, that are incentivizing teachers for teaching this curriculum? I hate to buy into conspiracy theories, but there's it's always an example of follow the money, and there's got to be money behind these kind of efforts.
Yeah, I mean, one of the largest organizations is the National Education Association, or the NEA, which is the nation's largest teachers union. They have been very clear. They even put out a resolution this past summer. You know, we've heard all these questions about the left saying CRT, critical race theory, is not taught anywhere in public schools. And the NEA explicitly itself adopted a resolution calling for the infusion of CRT into curriculum. So this, you know, having the clout of a national teachers union, they put out content. They are able to mobilize and essentially help push this narrative. You know, we saw them influence school closure policies during the pandemic, and we're seeing them push a lot of this content around the country. So that's absolutely one of them. And again, now we're seeing state and national media outlets essentially jumping on board with that narrative to imply that parents having access to their content is somehow a nefarious idea.
Matt Beienburg, he's Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute, an op-ed in the Washington Times. If you search for that, I'll link to it on my social media, and also follow on Twitter, Goldwater INST. Matt, how else can people find you?
We have our website, goldwaterinstitute.org. Happy to look me up on Twitter, social media, but we've put our information out there trying to make sure that folks are looking at the academic or curriculum transparency bills in their states and jumping on board with that.
Matt, great to have you on. Thanks for your time, bud.